What happens when a group of racist men targets the wrong black woman, thinking she's an easy victim, only to find out that she is a former Navy SEAL? Watch as she fights back against the group and uncovers a shocking secret that leads to wide-scale justice against racism in the community. The sun bathed the park in a soft, golden glow, casting long shadows of swaying trees over the worn paths. Laughter from a distant group of children playing on the swings mingled with the faint chirping of birds. On a lone bench near the edge of a small pond, Morgan Blake sat quietly, taking a rare moment to enjoy the stillness of the afternoon. Her black leather jacket rested beside her, revealing a muscular frame beneath a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. A faint scar on her forearm, just visible under the sunlight, was the only hint of a life forged in battles far from here. Morgan's eyes scanned her surroundings, more out of habit than suspicion. A jogger passed by, giving her a polite nod, which she returned. Her time as a Navy SEAL had sharpened her instincts, and even now, years removed from active duty, she couldn't help but notice the small details: the awkward shuffle of a man a few yards away, a group of teenagers lingering too long near a playground. Nothing seemed particularly unusual, but something about the air felt off. Across the park, a group of 4 men loitered near the base of an old oak tree. Their laughter was sharp and mean, cutting through the tranquil ambiance like a blade. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a black hoodie, leaned casually against the tree, surveying the park like a predator stalking prey. Gary Tank Walker wasn't the kind of man who blended in. His shaved head gleamed in the sun, and the faded tattoos snaking up his neck hinted at a life lived on the fringes. He nudged the man next to him, a wiry figure with a patchy beard, and gestured in Morgan's direction. "That one," Tank muttered, his voice low but carrying a sneer. "Sitting there all smug like she owns the place." "Easy pickings," Patchy Beard chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "Think she'll put up a fight?" Tank smirked. "She'll try. They always do." Morgan felt their eyes on her before she saw them. A subtle prickle ran down her spine, and her body tensed ever so slightly. She turned her head slowly, catching their gaze for just a moment. They didn't look away. That was her first confirmation. They were trouble. She kept her posture relaxed, one arm draped over the back of the bench, the other resting on her lap. Her breathing remained steady, but her mind began to assess. 4 of them. Broad shoulders on the leader, wiry build on the second. The other 2 were younger, maybe early 20s, with cocky postures that screamed overconfidence. A mix of cheap cologne and cigarettes wafted over on the breeze, confirming their proximity. "All right, gentlemen," Morgan muttered under her breath, a hint of a wry smile forming. "Let's see what you've got." The men began to move, their conversation growing louder as they crossed the park toward her. Their laughter carried over the playground, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who quickly looked away, uninterested in getting involved. Tank walked in front, his stride slow and deliberate. Patchy Beard and the 2 younger men flanked him like wolves circling a lone deer. Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted slightly, making herself look just vulnerable enough to tempt them further. Her instincts told her these men were used to picking off easy targets, feeding on fear. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Yet, Tank reached the edge of the path near Morgan's bench, his boots crunching against the gravel. His smirk widened, exposing teeth stained from years of cigarettes and cheap coffee. Behind him, Patchy Beard chuckled, while the 2 younger men exchanged a glance, their excitement barely contained. They spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around Morgan's bench. "Afternoon, ma'am," Tank said, his voice oily and dripping with mock politeness. "Mighty nice day for sitting out here all alone, don't you think?" Morgan looked up slowly, her expression calm, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey she wasn't intimidated. "It was," she said evenly. "What do you want?" Tank chuckled, glancing back at his crew as if Morgan had told a joke. "Now, that's no way to greet friendly folks just out for a chat. You got something against a few good old boys stopping to say hi?" Patchy Beard leaned closer, his grin revealing yellowed teeth. Or maybe she's just one of them types, Tank. Thinking she's too good to talk to the likes of us. Morgan didn't answer, her gaze darting between them, reading their postures, calculating distances. They were close now. Too close. Close enough that any sudden move could spark the conflict she knew was brewing. "You hear me, lady?" Patchy Beard's voice turned sharp. "You think you're better than us?" One of the younger men, his face flushed with sunburn, sneered. "Bet she's one of those uppity ones, thinking this park belongs to her kind now." Morgan's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't think anything belongs to me. I'm just sitting here, minding my business." "Oh, you hear that, boys?" Tank drawled, stepping closer. "She's just minding her business. Guess we'll mind it for her." He pointed at the bag resting beside Morgan on the bench. "That's a nice bag. Bet it's got something good in it. Why don't you be polite and hand it over? We wouldn't want things to get messy." Morgan's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, into a faint smirk. "Is that what you call polite these days? Stealing from people who look like me?" Tank's face darkened, the fake smile dropping for a moment. "Now, what's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means," Morgan shot back, her voice cold. "You didn't pick me because I'm sitting alone. You picked me because you think I'm an easy target." The younger man stepped closer, his voice rising with anger. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Probably the same one you use to cry racism every time things don't go your way." Morgan stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. The shift in height gave her a presence they weren't expecting. She was shorter than Tank, but carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had stood in far worse places than this. Her calm, unwavering gaze unsettled them, though none of them would admit it. "You really think this is going to go the way you planned?" she said quietly, her tone measured, each word a challenge. "Walk away, while you still can." Patchy Beard laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to it. "Look at her, trying to play tough. What are you going to do, lady? Call the cops? Like they'd show up for someone like you." The younger men joined in the laughter, emboldened by the twisted camaraderie of their group. Tank stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He was no longer playing around. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension, and Morgan felt the shift. This was the moment. "I don't think you're listening, lady," Tank said, his voice low and venomous. "We're taking that bag. And maybe we'll take something else, too." Morgan's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was to come. Her SEAL instincts kicked in, analyzing every angle, every escape route, every weakness in their formation. Her mind replayed the lessons drilled into her during years of grueling training. Stay calm, control the situation, strike hard, and don't stop until the threat is neutralized. But she waited. They hadn't made the first move yet, and she needed to be sure the threat was imminent. Her hands, seemingly relaxed at her sides, subtly shifted into position, ready for action. Tank leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "This ain't a game, lady. Give us the damn bag, or we're going to show you what happens when you don't respect your betters." Morgan met his gaze, her voice like steel. "You're going to regret this." Morgan gripped the strap of her bag tightly and stood, her body tense, but her face calm. The group of men watched her with sneers and mocking eyes, expecting her to react out of fear. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder, keeping her voice steady as she said, "I've got somewhere to be." Without waiting for a response, she turned and started walking. Her steps were measured, her breathing controlled, though her pulse quickened. She had no intention of running. It would only embolden them. But she wasn't about to stand there and give them the satisfaction of a response. Behind her, their voices rose, taunting and louder now, like a pack of jackals circling their prey. "Hey, where you going?" one of the younger men called, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "We ain't done talking, lady." Morgan ignored him, keeping her pace steady as she scanned for an exit. The park's main thoroughfare was ahead, but the tree-lined path she had chosen felt suddenly too quiet, too far removed from the safety of crowds. The crunch of their footsteps on gravel grew louder, closer. Her jaw tightened. "Come on now. Don't be like that," Patchy Beard jeered. "Ain't you used to folks like us talking to you? Or you too good for that?" Morgan clenched her teeth, fighting the urge to look back. She rounded a corner and stopped abruptly when she realized her mistake. The clearing ahead was wide and open, but they had moved faster than she expected. They blocked the path now, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Tank stood in the center, his broad shoulders squared, his smug grin daring her to make a move. Patchy Beard was at his side, cracking his knuckles, while the two younger men flanked them, leaning casually against trees as if they had all the time in the world. "Well now," Tank drawled, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Look at you, all cornered. Bet you didn't think this one through, did you?" Morgan turned to glance behind her, but one of the younger men had circled back, cutting off her escape route. She was boxed in, her eyes flicked between them, reading their stances, their movements. Her body was calm, but her mind was racing. There was no reasoning with them, not with men like these. Tank took a step forward, his grin widening. "You lost, sweetheart? This ain't your part of town." Morgan met his gaze, her voice calm but cold. "I'm not lost. Now if you'll move, I'll be on my way." Patchy Beard chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, you think you can just walk away? Like we're just gonna let you? Nah, lady, you don't get it. This ain't a free ride for your kind." Morgan's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't want any trouble." "Oh, we know you don't," Tank sneered. "People like you never do. Just want to sit there all smug, acting like you belong, like you can just take up space like the rest of us. But see, that's the thing. You don't." One of the younger men pushed off the tree, pointing at Morgan with an accusing finger. "She thinks she's better than us. You see it, right? The way she looks at us, like she's too good. Probably one of those types who cries racism every time something doesn't go her way." "Yeah," Patchy Beard added, his voice sharpening. "Bet she's had it easy her whole life. Probably never worked a day for nothing. Everything handed to her just 'cause of some pity sob story." Morgan exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "You don't know anything about me." Tank's smirk turned into a sneer. "Oh, I know enough. You're just like the rest of 'em. Always looking for a handout, always expecting everyone else to step aside. Well, guess what? Not today." Morgan shifted slightly, adjusting her stance. Her calm, steely gaze didn't waver. "I've already warned you. Walk away, and this ends here." Patchy Beard threw his head back in laughter. "Warn us? Listen to her, Tank. Think she's in charge here." "You ain't in charge of nothing, lady," Tank growled, his tone darkening. "You're gonna hand over that bag, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk out of here without a bruise." Morgan scanned their faces, her instincts kicking in. These men weren't here for her bag. That was just the excuse. This was about power, about making her feel small. They wanted her to submit. They wanted a show. She stood her ground, her voice steady and sharp. "You've had your chance." The words were barely out of her mouth before one of the younger men lunged at her. Morgan sidestepped smoothly, her movements quick and precise. She didn't strike, not yet. Her SEAL instincts told her to act fast and decisively, but she needed them to cross the line fully. Tank's face twisted with rage as he barked, "What are you waiting for? Get her!" Tank's order hung in the air for only a second before the younger man lunged again, this time with more force. Morgan moved instinctively, stepping aside and grabbing his arm in one fluid motion. Using his momentum against him, she twisted sharply, sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp. He groaned, clutching his arm as he rolled onto his side, momentarily out of the fight. The group froze for a beat, their faces shifting from smug confidence to shocked disbelief. Morgan turned her attention to the rest of them, her stance calm but unyielding. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "I told you to walk away," Patchy Beard sneered, though there was hesitation in his movements now. "Oh, you're gonna regret that, lady." Tank stepped forward, his imposing frame towering over her. "Think you're tough, huh? We'll see how long that lasts." He swung at her, a wide, uncoordinated blow meant to overwhelm rather than connect. Morgan ducked easily, her movements smooth and practiced. She drove her elbow into his ribs as she rose, forcing him to stumble back, his breath hitching. He clutched his side, his face contorting with pain and anger. "Come on, all of you!" Tank barked, motioning for the others. "Take her down!" Morgan's muscles tensed as the remaining men closed in. Patchybeard moved first, his fists raised, swinging wildly at her. She deflected his strikes with precision, her movements economical and deliberate. A sharp kick to his knee sent him reeling, his balance faltering just enough for Morgan to shove him backward. He hit the ground with a thud, cursing loudly. The younger man who had been leaning against the tree rushed her next, his approach more cautious but no less aggressive. Morgan stepped into his attack, blocking his swing and driving her palm into his chest. The impact forced him to stumble back, gasping for air, but he managed to stay on his feet. He glared at her, his face red with exertion. "You're gonna pay for that," he growled, circling her warily. Morgan didn't respond. Her eyes stayed locked on him, her body poised to react. She felt the familiar burn of adrenaline coursing through her veins, her focus razor-sharp. This wasn't just a fight, it was survival. Tank recovered and advanced again, his movements slower but more deliberate this time. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. "You think you can walk into our park and show us up?" Morgan turned to face him fully, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't your park, and I'm not the one showing anyone up. You've done that to yourselves." Her words only seemed to enrage him further. He feinted left, then threw a punch aimed at her head. Morgan ducked and countered with a swift strike to his torso, followed by a low kick to his shin. Tank stumbled but stayed upright, his fists swinging again, more out of frustration than strategy. Morgan sidestepped effortlessly, forcing him to overextend and lose balance. "Come on, Tank!" Patchybeard shouted, struggling to his feet. "Stop playing around." Morgan caught movement in her periphery and turned just in time to block an attack from one of the younger men. He had grabbed a tree branch, swinging it like a bat, but Morgan stepped inside his reach and twisted it out of his hands. A quick shove sent him backward, and he tripped over his own feet, landing hard on the gravel path. Tank roared in frustration, charging at her with everything he had. This time, Morgan let him come closer, sidestepping at the last second and using his momentum to drive him into a nearby tree. The impact was solid, and Tank staggered, clutching the bark for support as he tried to regain his footing. Patchybeard, emboldened by her brief distraction, lunged at her from behind. Morgan felt his presence and spun, catching him mid-charge. She delivered a sharp elbow strike to his chest, followed by a push that sent him crashing to the ground once again. The fight was chaotic and relentless, but Morgan's movements were precise, her training evident in every calculated strike. Still, she wasn't unscathed. Her ribs ached from a poorly blocked punch, and her forearm throbbed where the younger man's branch had grazed her. But she pushed the pain aside, her focus unbroken. Tank stumbled back into the clearing, his face twisted in fury. "You think this is over?" he snarled, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "You're gonna regret this, lady. You're gonna regret messing with us." Morgan straightened, her breathing steady despite the effort she'd exerted. "No," she said, her tone ice-cold. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The remaining men, bruised and battered, exchanged uncertain glances. Patchybeard was slow to rise, his confidence visibly shaken. One of the younger men backed away, muttering something under his breath about it not being worth it. But Tank wasn't done. His pride and his ego wouldn't let him back down. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You don't know what you've started." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Then let's finish it." But before either of them could move, a distant sound pierced the tension, the faint wail of approaching sirens. The gang's heads snapped toward the sound, their expressions shifting from anger to uncertainty. Tank's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to decide whether his pride was worth the risk of getting caught. "You hear that?" one of the younger men muttered, taking a cautious step back. "Cops are coming." "So what?" Tank barked, his voice rising in frustration. "We're not done here." Patchy Beard wasn't so sure. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at Tank. "Look, man, this ain't worth it." "Shut up," Tank growled, pointing a finger at him. "We don't run, we finish this." Morgan stood her ground, her breathing even despite the ache spreading through her ribs. She could see the fractures forming in their unity, the cracks in the facade of confidence that had emboldened them earlier. The sirens grew louder, closer, a promise of intervention that the gang couldn't ignore. "Tank," the younger man said again, his voice more urgent. "She's not worth it. Let's go." Tank turned back to Morgan, his eyes blazing with rage and frustration. He took a step toward her, his fists trembling at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might push forward, consequences be damned. But then the sirens gave a sharp, rising wail, close enough now that the red and blue flashes of police lights became visible through the trees. "Damn it!" Tank cursed, his voice cracking with anger. He shot Morgan a venomous glare. "This ain't over." Morgan's voice was cold and precise. "Yes, it is." With a growl of frustration, Tank turned on his heel, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's go! Move!" Patchy Beard didn't hesitate, limping after Tank with a grimace. The younger men exchanged one last glance at Morgan, their faces a mixture of anger and unease, before trailing after their leader. One of them muttered under his breath, "She's crazy," as they disappeared into the shadows of the tree line. Morgan stayed rooted in place, her body still coiled with tension. Her ears tracked the fading sound of their footsteps, her eyes scanning the clearing to make sure none of them doubled back. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to exhale. The sirens were nearly upon her now, the crunch of tires on gravel signaling the arrival of law enforcement. 2 squad cars pulled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, their lights painting the trees in bursts of red and blue. The officers stepped out cautiously, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a tall man with a clipped tone of authority, approached her. "Ma'am, are you okay? We got a call about a disturbance in the park." Morgan nodded, keeping her tone even. "I'm fine." "They're gone now." The officer's eyes lingered on her for a moment, noting the scrape on her arm and the subtle shift in her stance that betrayed the pain she was masking. "Did they hurt you?" Morgan shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Another officer scanned the area, noticing the disturbed dirt and a few items left behind. One of the younger men's hats, a discarded stick. He turned back toward his partner. "Looks like they ran in a hurry." The first officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe them?" Morgan hesitated, her mind racing through the events of the past several minutes. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by the dull ache of bruises and the sharp sting of her arm. 4 of them, mid-20s mostly. The leader's tall, shaved head, tattoos on his neck. Calls himself Tank. The officer nodded, jotting down her words. "Did they say anything? Anything to suggest why they targeted you?" Morgan's jaw tightened. She could still hear their words echoing in her head. The mocking tone, the slurs, the hatred barely disguised as bravado. She chose her words carefully. It wasn't random. They knew what they were doing. The officer's pen hovered over the page, his brow furrowing. "Meaning?" Morgan met his gaze evenly. "Meaning they've done this before, and they'll do it again." The officer's expression hardened as he finished taking notes. "We'll keep an eye out for them. In the meantime, we'd like you to come down to the station and file a formal report." Morgan nodded slowly. "I'll meet you there." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Morgan took a moment to steady herself. The clearing was quiet again, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the air. This wasn't over. Tank's parting words weren't just a threat, they were a challenge, and Morgan had no intention of backing down. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly overhead as Morgan sat in a chair across from Officer Reyes. Her expression was calm, but her body still thrummed with adrenaline. The confrontation at the park was over, but the weight of the men's words lingered, their hateful intent unmistakable. She replayed the encounter in her mind, Not just the physical fight, but the taunts, the sneers, and the pointed reminders of why they had chosen her as their target. Reyes, a young officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped open his notebook. "Let's start from the top, Ms. Blake. You said there were 4 men. You mentioned their leader calls himself Tank. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Morgan recounted the events in sharp, precise detail. Tank's mocking tone, the hateful comments, the way they surrounded her like a pack of wolves. Reyes's pen moved quickly across the page, his expression growing darker as her story unfolded. When she finished, he tapped the pen against his notebook thoughtfully. "This doesn't sound random. You're sure you've never seen these men before?" "I'm sure," Morgan replied. "They weren't after my bag. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone, and they thought they could intimidate me. They wanted me to feel out of place." Reyes frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Why do you think they singled you out?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Because I'm black." Reyes's pen froze mid-air. "They said that?" Morgan's jaw tightened. Not directly at first, but it was clear in everything they said. They made it obvious. Comments about me thinking I'm better than them, how people like me don't belong. This wasn't just about stealing something. They wanted me to feel small. Reyes sighed, closing his notebook with a faint snap. "We've had reports of harassment like this recently. Minor incidents in public spaces, mostly. But if this group is targeting people based on race," he trailed off, his frustration visible. "They are," Morgan said firmly. "And they've been doing it for a while. They were too comfortable, too confident. This wasn't their first time." Reyes leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I'll run their descriptions through the system and cross-reference any recent reports. But I'll be honest with you, Ms. Blake. Cases like this are hard to pin down. If victims don't press charges, or if there's no solid evidence, it's tough to build a case." Morgan's voice was sharp. "Then find the evidence. Because I'm not letting this slide." Hours later, Morgan sat in her living room, her laptop casting a faint glow as she scrolled through local news reports. She wasn't the type to sit back and hope for the best. Her military training had taught her to take initiative, and if Reyes needed more proof, she'd find it. It didn't take long to notice a disturbing pattern. In the past 6 months, there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults across the area, all involving groups of men targeting individuals in public spaces. In every case, the victims were people of color. Morgan's jaw clenched as she read through the accounts. The descriptions of the attackers were consistent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with tattoos on his neck, flanked by younger men, Tank. Many of the victims hadn't pressed charges, likely out of fear or frustration with the system. But their accounts all echoed the same sentiment. The attacks weren't just about theft. They were meant to send a message. As she dug deeper, Morgan came across a community forum discussing similar incidents. One thread in particular stood out. "These guys aren't just random thugs. They target minorities. They pick their spots, intimidate people, and get out fast. Nobody ever catches them." Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend, and a journalist known for chasing stories others avoided. "Heard about what happened. You okay? Call me." Morgan didn't hesitate. She hit the call button, and Sarah picked up on the first ring. "Morgan, I saw the news. What happened?" Morgan explained everything. The attack, the hateful remarks, and the patterns she'd uncovered. Sarah was silent for a moment before replying, her voice grim. "It sounds like this isn't just a group of punks. If they're this organized and targeting minorities, this could be a hate group." "That's exactly what it is," Morgan said. "And I'm not letting them get away with it." Sarah sighed. "I get it. But these people are dangerous, Morgan. If you dig too deep, they came after me because they thought I'd back down." Morgan interrupted. "That I'd just let it happen. They were wrong." There was another pause before Sarah spoke again, her tone resigned but supportive. "What do you need?" "Anything you can find," Morgan replied. "Where they hang out, how long they've been doing this, why the police haven't stopped them. Anything." Sarah hesitated. "I'll see what I can do." But promise me you'll be careful. These kinds of people don't take kindly to being exposed." Morgan didn't answer immediately. She stared at her laptop screen, the faces of Tank and his crew etched into her memory. Finally, she said, "I'll be careful. But this ends now." As the call ended, Morgan leaned back in her chair. Her body still ached from the fight, but the pain only fueled her resolve. These men thought they could scare her into silence. They thought they could get away with it. They were wrong. The next morning, Morgan sat at her dining table, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, her laptop open in front of her. The faint hum of the neighborhood waking up drifted through the window. Children playing, dogs barking, a distant lawnmower. It was a sharp contrast to the darkness she'd been sifting through online. Sarah had come through overnight, sending Morgan a series of links and documents tied to Tank and his gang. The evidence painted a clearer picture of their activities and their connections. This wasn't just a group of thugs harassing people in parks. They were part of a larger, loosely organized network that operated under the radar, targeting minorities in small, calculated ways. Morgan skimmed the files again, her jaw tightening. The incidents weren't random. They were coordinated. Assaults, vandalism, and intimidation tactics were all aimed at driving fear into specific communities. And there were rumors of a leader above Tank, someone who was pulling strings and keeping the group in line. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was Officer Reyes. "Blake," she answered, her tone sharp. "Morning," Reyes said. His voice was tight, as though he hadn't slept much. "I've been looking into the names you gave me. You were right. This Tank guy isn't some random punk. He's tied to a string of reported incidents, and his group's been causing trouble for months." "I could have told you that," Morgan replied. "What are you doing about it?" "That's the problem," Reyes admitted. "Most of the victims didn't press charges, so there's no paper trail. It's hard to connect everything legally." "Then make a trail," Morgan snapped. "If I can find this much information on my own, you have the resources to dig deeper. Don't tell me your hands are tied." Reyes sighed heavily. "Look, I want to take these guys down as much as you do, but without solid evidence, anything we do could blow up in court. If they walk, it's over." Morgan clenched her teeth. She hated the bureaucracy of justice systems, the endless hoops to jump through while people like Tank continued to operate unchecked. "So, what's your plan?" Reyes hesitated. "There's a rumor floating around the station that Tank's crew might be connected to a bigger group. We're talking hate crimes, maybe even domestic terror activity. If that's true, the feds might get involved." Morgan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. And that means we need something concrete before we can escalate it," Reyes said. "We're working on it, but it's going to take time." Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. Time wasn't something she was willing to give men like Tank. "I'll do my part," she said finally. "But you better be ready when I bring you something." Reyes sighed again. "Don't do anything stupid, Blake." She hung up without answering. That evening, Morgan found herself in a nondescript coffee shop across town, sitting across from Sarah. The journalist looked tired but determined. Her laptop opened beside her as she flipped through notes. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, sliding a folder across the table. "Tank's gang is just one piece. There are at least 3 other groups like his operating in the region. Different names, different tactics, but the same goal, intimidation." Morgan flipped through the folder, her frown deepening with each page. Photos of graffiti, mugshots of other gang members, maps with red circles marking incidents. It was a coordinated effort, designed to instill fear and exert control. "This isn't just about harassment," Morgan muttered. "They're trying to push people out, make them feel unsafe in their own neighborhoods." Sarah nodded grimly. "And they've been getting away with it because the incidents are small enough not to draw national attention. Nobody's connecting the dots." Morgan's mind raced. She could feel the pieces falling into place, each one more damning than the last. If they could find the leader above Tank, they might be able to dismantle the whole operation. "What about funding?" Morgan asked. "No way this is just a few angry men with too much free time. Someone's backing them." "That's the tricky part," Sarah said. "There's talk of private donations, maybe even ties to certain groups, but nothing solid. Yet, Morgan leaned back, her arms crossed. Then we go after Tank first. He's the weak link. If we can turn him, he might lead us to whoever's running this. Sarah looked hesitant. That's risky. You know he's not going to just roll over. Morgan's expression hardened. Then we'll make him. If Reyes won't push hard enough, I will. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Morgan held up a hand. I know what I'm doing. I didn't survive everything I've been through just to let men like him win. This ends now. Sarah sighed, her expression softening. Just promise me you'll be careful. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. Careful doesn't win wars. As she left the coffee shop, Morgan's mind was set. Tank had slipped through her fingers once, but she wouldn't let it happen again. He was the key to unraveling this entire operation, and she was going to bring him down. No matter what it took, Morgan moved through the shadows of the city like a ghost, her presence unnoticed by the world around her. The soft hum of distant traffic provided a steady backdrop as she approached the rundown bar Sarah had flagged in her research. Tank and his crew had been known to frequent this place, a seedy, dimly lit dive on the edge of town, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and bad intentions. She stopped just short of the entrance, blending into the shadows as she scoped out the area. Two men stood near the door, chatting idly, their voices low but their body language defensive. They weren't dressed like Tank's crew, but Morgan knew better than to trust appearances. She adjusted her cap, pulling it lower over her face, and slipped inside without drawing their attention. The bar was a dark, claustrophobic space, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Morgan's eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the room for familiar faces. She spotted Patchy Beard almost immediately, sitting in a booth with one of the younger men from the park. They were hunched over their drinks, their conversation animated. Neither of them noticed her as she moved toward the bar. The bartender, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, glanced up as she approached. "What'll it be?" "Information," Morgan said quietly, sliding a 20 across the counter. "I'm looking for someone. Big guy, shaved head, tattoos on his neck, goes by Tank." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the booth where Patchy Beard sat. "Never heard of him." Morgan slid another bill across the counter. "You sure?" He hesitated, glancing toward the booth again before leaning in. "They were here earlier, left in a hurry when word got around the cops were looking for him. Heard him mention something about the warehouse on Fletcher Street. That's all I know." Morgan nodded, slipping him one more bill for good measure. "Thanks." She left the bar as quietly as she'd entered, her mind already working through the possibilities. Fletcher Street was in the industrial part of town, a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. If Tank was hiding out there, it wouldn't be easy to find him, but it also meant he was running out of options. An hour later, Morgan crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her eyes fixed on a dimly lit warehouse. The place was quiet, but she could see movement through the broken windows, shadows shifting against the faint glow of a single overhead light. Her instincts told her she'd found the right spot. Tank's crew wasn't big enough to maintain full security, but she knew better than to expect an unguarded hideout. She scanned the area, her SEAL training guiding her assessment of potential entry points and threats. Two figures stood near the main entrance, their postures tense. One of them was smoking, the orange glow of the cigarette briefly illuminating his face. Morgan recognized him as one of the younger men from the park. The other was unfamiliar, but his build suggested he wasn't someone to take lightly. Morgan's breath was steady as she formulated her plan. She needed to get inside without drawing attention, but she also needed leverage. If Tank was here, he wouldn't give up anything willingly, not without a reason. Slipping around the side of the warehouse, Morgan found a broken window partially hidden by overgrown bushes. She tested the frame carefully, wincing as it creaked faintly under her touch. Sliding inside, she landed silently on the concrete floor, crouching low as she surveyed the space. The warehouse was as dilapidated as she expected, its walls streaked with grime and its air heavy with the smell of oil and decay. The faint murmur of voices reached her ears, and she moved toward the sound, keeping to the shadows. Tank's voice was unmistakable, a low growl that carried authority even in a whisper. "I told you. We lay low until this blows over. No more park jobs. Not until I say so." Patchy Beard's response was quieter, his tone tinged with frustration. "You're acting like we can just sit on our hands. People are asking questions." "Let 'em ask," Tank snapped. "We don't move until I say so. End of discussion." Morgan crept closer, her footsteps silent on the concrete. From her vantage point behind a stack of crates, she could see Tank standing near a makeshift table, his large frame illuminated by the weak light overhead. Patchy Beard and another man sat nearby, their body language tense. A handful of others lingered in the shadows, their faces indistinct, but their presence clear. She needed a way to draw Tank out, something to force his hand without putting herself in immediate danger. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Sarah. "Found him. Warehouse on Fletcher. Call Reyes. Now." As she hit send, she adjusted her stance, preparing for the next move. She wasn't leaving without answers, but she wasn't reckless enough to take on Tank and his crew alone. The sirens had bought her time at the park, but this time she'd need more than luck to win. Morgan's voice cut through the tense silence. "Tank!" The room froze, every head snapping toward her. Tank's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his face darkening with recognition. "You." Morgan straightened, her expression calm but her gaze sharp. "We're going to have a conversation." Tank laughed, the sound low and menacing. "You think you can just walk in here and start making demands?" Morgan's tone was cold as steel. "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. Because if you don't, this place will be swarming with cops in less than 5 minutes. Tank's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "You don't scare me." Morgan stepped closer, her stance unyielding. "You should be." Tank's crew exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado fading as Morgan stepped closer. Her calm, unyielding presence filled the room, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've got guts," Tank said, his voice strained as he tried to hold on to his confidence. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Morgan's sharp gaze swept the room, counting the men. 5 in total, including Tank. Her expression didn't waver. "Outnumbered? I've seen worse odds. And guess what? They didn't win either." Tank's fists clenched at his sides. "Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero?" "No," Morgan replied coldly. "I'm just the one who's going to make sure you answer for what you've done." Before Tank could respond, the faint wail of police sirens reached the warehouse. The sound grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights casting shifting shadows across the grimy walls. Tank froze, his smirk finally slipping into an expression of genuine alarm. "You called the cops!" Patchy Beard spat, his voice rising in panic. He looked toward the exit, his instincts screaming at him to run. Morgan's voice was steel. "You think I came here without a plan? It's over. Don't let her scare you," Tank barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own uncertainty. "We've handled worse than this." "Have you?" Morgan said, stepping forward, "because, from where I'm standing, you're about to lose everything." The sound of tires crunching gravel outside was followed by slamming car doors and the muffled voices of officers approaching the warehouse. Tank's crew shifted uneasily, looking to their leader for direction, but even he seemed momentarily at a loss. "Tank, what do we do?" one of the younger men whispered urgently. Tank turned on him, his face twisting in frustration. "Shut up and stay put." "We're not running!" Morgan's voice cut through the rising chaos. "You don't have to run, but you will face the consequences." Patchy Beard, his nerve finally breaking, bolted toward the back exit. Morgan moved like a flash, intercepting him before he could reach the door. She grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced precision and forcing him to his knees. He yelped, his bravado crumbling into panic. "You're not going anywhere," Morgan said evenly, her grip firm. Tank and the others stared, their hesitation giving the officers outside time to act. The front doors burst open and a team of uniformed police stormed in, their weapons drawn, but their voices commanding. "Police! Hands in the air!" one officer barked. Tank's face twisted in rage, but he raised his hands reluctantly. The younger men followed suit, their fear outweighing their loyalty to their leader. Within moments, the officers moved in, quickly restraining the group and placing them in handcuffs. Morgan released Patchy Beard, stepping back as an officer took over. She straightened, her sharp gaze still fixed on Tank as he was cuffed and pulled to his feet. "You think this changes anything?" Tank snarled at her. "You think you've stopped us?" Morgan stepped closer, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're done. The people you've hurt, the fear you've spread, it ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too." Tank glared at her, his bravado now a hollow shell. The officers led him and his crew out of the warehouse, their voices fading as the group was escorted to waiting squad cars. Officer Reyes approached Morgan, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "You weren't kidding when you said you'd bring us something concrete." Morgan crossed her arms, her posture unwavering. "You've got them now. Don't let them slip through the cracks." Reyes nodded. "We'll make sure they don't. You've done more than your part here, Blake." Morgan didn't respond immediately. Her eyes lingered on the warehouse, the echoes of the confrontation still fresh in her mind. Finally, she said, "This isn't over. Tank's just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and I'm going to find them." Reyes frowned. "We'll do what we can, but don't go after them alone. You've already done enough." Morgan gave him a small, cold smile. "We both know I don't stop halfway." As the officers finished clearing the scene, Morgan turned and walked away, the faint chill of the night air brushing against her face. Tank and his crew were in custody, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The dim light of Morgan's laptop screen flickered across her face as she leaned forward, her fingers tapping quickly across the keyboard. It was well past midnight, but the adrenaline from Tank's capture still coursed through her veins. The warehouse bust had given her and the authorities a solid win, but she knew it was just a piece of the puzzle. Tank's operations weren't isolated. They were part of something bigger, and she needed to know who was pulling the strings. Across from her, Sarah sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through a series of documents on her tablet. Her usual sharp wit was dulled by exhaustion, but the determination in her eyes matched Morgan's. "So, Reyes confirmed they're keeping Tank in holding for now," Sarah said. "But if they don't get something concrete to charge him with, he'll lawyer up and walk. We can't let that happen." "He's not walking," Morgan said firmly. "Not if we can prove he's tied to the larger network." Sarah frowned, her fingers pausing mid-scroll. "It's not going to be easy. These groups are careful. They keep their operations decentralized, so no one person has all the answers. That's why we focus on Tank," Morgan replied. "He knows more than he's letting on. We just need to make him talk." Sarah hesitated, her brows furrowing. "And if he doesn't?" Morgan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we find another way. Someone else in his crew knows something. Patchy Beard, one of the younger guys. They're followers, not leaders. They'll crack before he does." The next morning, Morgan met Reyes at the police station. The atmosphere was tense, the faint buzz of ringing phones and murmured conversations filling the air. Reyes led her down a quiet hallway to the interrogation rooms. "Tank's in there," Reyes said, nodding toward a door with a small observation window. "He hasn't said much since last night. Just a lot of posturing." Morgan folded her arms. "Let me talk to him." Reyes hesitated, his expression skeptical. "You sure? He's the type who'll try to get under your skin." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "He can try. It won't work." Reyes opened the door, and Morgan stepped inside. Tank sat at the metal table, his broad shoulders hunched as he leaned back in the chair. His wrists were cuffed, but his expression was one of defiance. He looked up as she entered, a smirk curling his lips. "Well, if it isn't Wonder Woman," he drawled. "What? They send you in here to finish what you started?" Morgan pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "You're in a lot of trouble, Tank." He laughed, the sound hollow. "Trouble, lady? This is a hiccup. I'll be out of here before you finish your coffee." "Not this time," Morgan said, her voice low and steady. "Your crew's already folding. Patchy beards singing like a bird. The younger guys? They're terrified. It's only a matter of time before they give us everything we need. Tank's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he leaned forward. You're bluffing. Try me, Morgan said, holding his gaze. You think you're the only one who's good at reading people? You're not as untouchable as you think. Tank's jaw tightened, the bravado slipping further. Morgan pressed on. We already know about the other groups, the other crews operating in the area. We know you're connected to something bigger. But you're small time. The guy above you, he doesn't care about you. The second you're a liability, you're gone. Tank's hands clenched into fists, his frustration boiling over. You don't know what you're talking about. Morgan leaned in, her voice quiet but cutting. Don't I? If you're smart, you'll start talking. Because the people you're protecting, they won't protect you. The door opened and Reyes stepped in, holding a folder. He set it on the table, flipping it open to reveal photos and reports tied to Tank's crew. He slid one of the photos across the table. A surveillance image of Tank with a man Morgan didn't recognize. That's your boss, isn't it? Morgan said, nodding toward the photo. The one pulling the strings. What's his name? Tank stared at the photo, his jaw working as he fought to maintain his composure. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until finally he slumped back in his chair. You don't get it, he muttered, his voice bitter. Even if I told you, it wouldn't matter. He's untouchable. Morgan's eyes narrowed. Let us worry about that. Tank hesitated, his gaze flicking between Morgan and Reyes. For the first time, the cracks in his facade were fully visible. His name's Paul Hendricks. He's the one running things. Morgan exchanged a glance with Reyes, her expression hardening. They had a name, but it wasn't over yet. Later, as Morgan and Sarah reconvened at the coffee shop, the weight of the name Tank had given them hung between them. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, pulling up information on Paul Hendricks. He's a businessman, Sarah said, her tone incredulous. Runs a few construction companies. On the surface, it all looks clean. Morgan frowned, leaning over the screen. And underneath? Not so clean, Sarah replied. A few shell companies, ties to fringe political groups. It's subtle, but it's there. Morgan's mind raced. Hendricks was the link they needed, but he wouldn't go down easily. She glanced at Sarah, her expression resolute. Then we make him answer for it. Morgan sat in the bustling precinct conference room, its sterile walls now covered in printouts, photos, and maps connected by bright red strings pinned across a corkboard. Paul Hendricks's name sat at the center of it all, circled in thick black marker. Officers shuffled around the room, reviewing files and comparing notes, but Morgan's focus was on Reyes, who stood by the board, briefing a small team. This is where it gets tricky, Reyes said, pointing to a cluster of pins marking Hendricks's businesses. On paper, the man's spotless. All his operations are legit, at least as far as we can tell. But thanks to Tank's testimony and Morgan's intel, we've got enough to suspect he's using his construction companies as a front to fund and coordinate these hate groups. Sarah, seated at the corner of the table with her laptop, raised a hand. I found some unusual financial activity tied to Hendricks. Shell companies moving money around, donations to political organizations with extremist ties. It's subtle, but it's there. Reyes nodded, his jaw tightening. Subtle isn't enough for a warrant, though. We need something concrete. Bank statements, communications, anything that ties Hendricks directly to these groups. Morgan crossed her arms, her expression grim. What about the crew we picked up? Tank gave us Hendricks's name. Patchy Beard and the others must know something. They're scared, Reyes admitted. The idea of flipping on Hendricks has them rattled. They know how dangerous he is. Morgan stepped forward, her tone firm. Then we push harder. Hendricks isn't going to stop. If we don't act, more people will get hurt. Later that day, Morgan sat across from Patchy Beard in an interrogation room. The man's bravado from the park was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him shift constantly in his seat. His eyes darted to the mirror on the wall, then back to Morgan. You don't get it, he said, his voice shaky. Paul's got connections. Big ones. If he finds out I talked, He'll what? Morgan interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. You're already in custody. Do you think he's going to stick his neck out for you? Men like Hendricks don't protect people like you. They use you. Patchy Beard's hands fidgeted on the table. I didn't think it'd go this far. The park stuff, the harassment, it was just supposed to scare people. But Paul's always had bigger plans. Morgan leaned in, her eyes sharp. What plans? Patchy Beard hesitated, the weight of his decision clear on his face. Finally, he exhaled heavily. He's using us to stir up chaos. Fear makes people easy to control, you know? Paul's got ties to groups that want to push laws, policies, stuff that benefits them. We're just the boots on the ground. Morgan's stomach turned, but she kept her expression neutral. And the funding? How does it work? He launders it through the construction companies, Patchy Beard admitted, his voice low. Sends the money to shell accounts. Then it gets funneled to the crews. We get our cut for doing the dirty work. Reyes, watching from behind the glass, stepped into the room, a file in hand. That's enough to start connecting the dots, he said, setting the folder on the table. But we'll need you to testify. Patchy Beard froze, his eyes wide with panic. Testify? Are you crazy? Paul will have me killed. Not if we take him down first, Morgan said firmly. Help us, and we'll make sure you're protected. Back in the conference room, Morgan and Reyes reviewed the new intel with Sarah. The financial trail Patchy Beard described matched what Sarah had uncovered, creating a clearer picture of Hendricks's operations. This is the break we needed, Sarah said, scrolling through her laptop. We can tie the money directly to Tank's crew and a few other groups operating in neighboring counties. With the paper trail and Tank's testimony, it's enough to get a search warrant. Reyes nodded, his expression resolute. I'll get the paperwork filed. Once we have the warrant, we'll raid Hendrick's main office. Morgan's jaw tightened. This isn't just about arresting him. We need to dismantle everything. His network, his funding, his influence. Otherwise, someone else will just take his place. Sarah placed a hand on Morgan's arm. One step at a time. Taking Hendricks down is the first step. The warrant was approved faster than expected. By evening, Morgan stood with Reyes and a team of officers outside Hendrick's sleek office building, its gleaming glass facade a stark contrast to the corruption hidden within. The team moved quickly, entering the building and securing the premises. Inside, Morgan watched as officers rifled through files, computers, and desk drawers. Sarah had joined the operation as an observer, snapping photos and taking notes for her eventual exposé. Reyes emerged from an office with a thick binder in hand, his expression triumphant. This is it, he said, holding up the binder. Transaction records, emails, it's all here. Hendricks is done. Morgan allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. But she knew the battle wasn't over. Hendricks's arrest was just the beginning of dismantling the network he had built. Morgan sat in the dimly lit conference room of the precinct, a map of the city spread across the table. Red and blue pins marked locations tied to incidents from the past year, parks, alleys, and small businesses, all clustered in neighborhoods targeted by Tank's crew and similar groups. Across from her, Officer Reyes shuffled through a stack of files, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is bigger than we thought, Reyes said, sliding one of the files toward Morgan. Hendricks's name pops up in connection with several of these incidents, but it's always indirect. Donations to questionable organizations, funding for businesses that suddenly went under after trouble, started in their neighborhoods. He's careful, keeps himself insulated. Morgan leaned over the map, her eyes narrowing as she traced the connections. Careful isn't untouchable. He's left a trail. It's just a matter of pulling it together. Sarah entered the room with a laptop under her arm and a determined look in her eyes. I've been digging into Hendricks's financials, she said, setting the laptop on the table and spinning it toward them. He's got money moving through a series of shell companies. On paper, it looks legitimate. Construction, consulting, community development, but the timing lines up with the start of these incidents. He's funneling funds to these groups under the guise of donations. Reyes frowned, flipping through the documents. If we can prove the money's being used to finance hate groups, that's a federal case. But we need more than circumstantial evidence. Morgan leaned back, her mind racing. Then we go after his people. Tank might not know much beyond his orders, but someone in Hendrix's circle does. He's not doing this alone. Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. If we can find out who's handling the logistics, fund transfers, meeting locations, that might give us what we need. Later that evening, Morgan and Reyes sat in an unmarked car outside a nondescript office building downtown. The glow of fluorescent lights spilled onto the sidewalk, casting long shadows across the empty street. Sarah's intel had pointed to this building as a potential hub for Hendrix's operations, a front for his network. "We're not going in without backup," Reyes said, his tone firm. Morgan's eyes stayed on the building. "We're not going in at all. Not yet. We watch, we gather intel, and we follow anyone who looks important." Reyes glanced at her, skeptical. "You really think someone's going to lead us straight to Hendrix?" "They always do," Morgan said, her voice steady. "Everyone makes a mistake eventually." Hours passed as they watched the building, their patience rewarded, when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the entrance. A well-dressed man in his 40s stepped out, glancing around nervously before entering the building. Morgan's eyes narrowed. "That's Thomas Kane," she said, recognizing him from one of Sarah's reports. "He's one of Hendrix's top guys. Handles the financials." Reyes reached for his radio. "We tail him when he leaves. If he's meeting Hendrix, we'll know soon enough." The tailing operation led them to an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. Morgan and Reyes watched from a distance as Kane entered and was greeted warmly by a man in a tailored suit, Paul Hendrix himself. The two men sat at a private table near the back, their conversation hidden behind thick glass and a curtain of privacy. "This is it," Morgan murmured. "We've got him." Reyes nodded, already on his radio to coordinate surveillance. "We'll get audio and visual. If they discuss anything incriminating, we'll have it." Hours later, back at the precinct, the recordings from the restaurant played on a monitor. Hendrix's voice was calm and measured, but the content of his words was damning. "We need to keep the pressure up in those neighborhoods," Hendrix said, his tone cold. "If they feel unsafe, they'll leave. And once they're gone, we move in. Cheap property, big profits." Kane responded, his voice quieter, but no less incriminating. "What about the crews? They're getting reckless." Hendrix's tone sharpened. "Then we replace them. These are tools, nothing more. As long as they get the job done, I don't care what happens to them." The room was silent as the recording ended. Reyes turned to Morgan, his expression grim. "That's enough to bring him in." Morgan's gaze stayed on the monitor, her voice firm. "It's enough to end this." Morgan stood in the center of the precinct's operations room, her arms crossed as Reyes and Sarah spread out the documents and photos they'd gathered. The name Paul Hendrix loomed over them like a dark cloud. Reyes had pulled Hendrix's files overnight, and the picture it painted was troubling. A respected businessman on the surface, but with ties to extremist groups that could no longer be ignored. "We've got a lot of circumstantial evidence," Reyes said, gesturing to the photos on the table. "Connections to fringe groups, suspicious payments moving through his shell companies, but nothing solid enough to take him down." "He's careful," Sarah added. "Everything about his public image screams respectability. Charitable donations, community projects, clean records. But these payments? They're too clean. Almost like someone went out of their way to cover something up." Morgan leaned forward, scanning the documents. Her finger traced a line on one of the financial reports. "These payments, they're too consistent. Same amount, same intervals. That's not charity, that's funding." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing. "And guess where they're going? Small organizations with vague descriptions, community initiatives, local improvement groups, all dead ends." "But not for us," Morgan said, her voice firm. "We've already connected him to Tank's crew. If we dig deep enough, we'll find the link to the other gangs." Reyes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're going to need more than suspicious payments and hearsay. We need testimony, evidence that directly ties him to these hate crimes. Morgan's jaw tightened. Then we lean on Tank. He's already cracked once. If we push him, he'll give us more. Reyes shook his head. Tank's scared, but he's also loyal. He won't go down without a fight. Loyalty only goes so far, Morgan said. He knows Hendricks won't protect him. He's a liability now. The interrogation room felt colder than before, the hum of the overhead light filling the silence as Morgan and Reyes faced Tank again. He looked more tired this time, the weight of his situation settling heavily on his broad shoulders. The defiance in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by wary calculation. Morgan placed a file on the table and slid it toward him. Inside were the same photos and reports Reyes had shown her earlier, but this time a new page sat on top. An arrest report for one of Tank's younger crew members. Your boy rolled over, Morgan said, her voice even. He gave us everything we needed to connect you to Hendricks. Tank's lips pressed into a thin line, his fists clenching on the table. He's lying. Morgan didn't flinch. You sure about that? Because if you're the last one standing, you're the one taking the fall. Hendricks isn't coming for you. You know that. Reyes leaned forward, his tone softer, but no less firm. Help us build the case against Hendricks, and you'll still have a chance. You don't. And you're looking at a laundry list of charges that'll bury you. Tank's jaw worked, the muscles twitching as he struggled with the decision. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally he exhaled sharply. All right, he muttered. What do you want to know? Morgan's eyes sharpened. Everything. How he funds you, how he communicates, the other crews he's tied to. You talk, or you go down alone. Tank nodded reluctantly, his voice low. It's all through his businesses. Construction companies, mostly. He launders the money through contracts, pays us through fronts. We're supposed to keep it quiet, but sometimes things get messy. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. The other groups? Tank hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, there's a few. Same setup. We don't work together directly, but we all know the deal. Keep people scared. Keep them out of his neighborhoods. Reyes scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. Morgan didn't break eye contact with Tank. How does he communicate with you? Through middlemen, Tank said. Guys who handle the money and pass along instructions. I've met Hendricks maybe twice. He doesn't like to get his hands dirty. Names, Morgan pressed. We need names. Tank rattled off a list of names and locations, each one more damning than the last. By the time he finished, Reyes looked up, his face grim but determined. This is enough to start, Reyes said. We'll cross-check everything. If it holds up, we've got him. Tank slumped back in his chair. The fight drained from him. You think this is over? Hendricks has people everywhere. You won't touch him. Morgan stood, her expression cold. Watch me. Back in the operations room, Morgan and Sarah reviewed the information Tank had provided. The names of Hendricks's middlemen gave them a clear trail to follow, and Reyes had already dispatched teams to track them down. The net was tightening, and Hendricks's untouchable image was beginning to crack. This is it, Sarah said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. We're finally getting somewhere. Morgan nodded, her focus unwavering. He's not invincible. He's just been playing the system. And now, we're going to take it apart. Morgan sat in the crowded conference room at the precinct, the air heavy with a mix of exhaustion and determination. The table was cluttered with files, photos, and notes, all pointing to one name, Paul Hendricks. The mountain of evidence Reyes's team had collected over the past week painted a damning picture. But Morgan knew the hard part was just beginning. Reyes stood at the front of the room, addressing a team of officers, prosecutors, and investigators. Hendricks's operation has been carefully built to avoid detection, but we've finally got enough to make our case. Thanks to Tank's cooperation, we have names, payment trails, and testimony linking him to multiple hate groups operating in the area. One of the prosecutors, a sharp-eyed woman named Simmons, flipped through the files in front of her. We need to make sure this sticks. Hendricks is well connected. and his lawyers are going to argue that none of this ties him directly to the crimes. Tank's testimony is our linchpin, Reyes replied. He can put Hendricks in the room and link him to the payments funding these groups. That's assuming he doesn't fold on the stand, Simmons said skeptically. We've all seen it happen before. The defense will tear him apart if they sense weakness. Morgan, seated at the edge of the table, leaned forward. Tank knows what's at stake. He's scared, and rightfully so. But he also knows Hendricks left him to rot. That betrayal is enough to keep him talking, Simmons nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Even so, we need more than his word. We need to show the jury a clear, undeniable connection between Hendricks and these crimes. Sarah, sitting beside Morgan with her laptop open, chimed in. We've got financial records that show money flowing from Hendricks's companies to shell accounts tied to Tank's crew and others like them. And those accounts are directly linked to payments for materials used in their operations. Flyers, graffiti supplies, even weapons in some cases. Morgan added, not to mention the communication logs. Tank's crew used burners, but some of those numbers connect to Hendricks' known associates. It's a pattern Hendricks can't explain away. Reyes nodded, his tone firm. This isn't just a hate crime case. It's a case about dismantling an entire network of intimidation and violence. If we do this right, we send a message that this kind of operation won't go unnoticed or unpunished. The following days were a blur of preparation. Morgan worked tirelessly alongside the team, piecing together the timeline of Hendricks's activities. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that he was the mastermind behind an extensive operation that had terrorized communities for years. Sarah spent hours digging into Hendricks's public image, uncovering speeches and interviews that subtly hinted at his beliefs. He's careful, she said, scrolling through a video of Hendricks addressing a business convention. He never says anything outright, but he uses phrases that dog whistle to the groups he's funding. Words like preserving community integrity or restoring tradition. It's coded language. That's not enough to convict, Simmons said during a late-night meeting, but it's enough to show intent when combined with everything else. Morgan's focus was unwavering as they rehearsed every angle of the case. Tank's testimony would be central, but they also had bank records, intercepted communications, and a paper trail that led straight to Hendricks's desk. The evidence was overwhelming, but Morgan knew Hendricks's defense team would attack every crack they could find. On the eve of the trial, Morgan found herself alone in the precinct, staring at a whiteboard filled with photos and notes. Hendricks's face stared back at her, his smug expression a reminder of the power he wielded. She thought about the victims, the people Tank's crew had terrorized, the neighborhoods Hendricks had tried to control through fear. This case wasn't just about justice for her, it was about justice for all of them. Reyes entered the room, breaking her thoughts. You've done a lot to get us here, Blake. I hope you know that. Morgan didn't turn from the board. It's not enough until he's behind bars. Reyes leaned against the doorframe. The prosecution is ready. Sarah's work on the financials sealed a lot of gaps. And Tank? He's scared. But he knows this is his only shot at saving himself. Morgan finally turned to face him. Do you think it'll be enough? Reyes's expression was resolute. It has to be. The courtroom was packed the next day as the trial began, the air thick with anticipation. Hendricks sat at the defense table, his expensive suit and calm demeanor projecting confidence. But Morgan could see the tension in his clenched jaw, the way his eyes darted toward his lawyers when the prosecution began presenting their case. Tank's testimony was a turning point. Though he was visibly nervous, his words were clear and damning. He detailed the payments, the orders, and the unspoken understanding that Hendricks was the man at the top. The defense attempted to discredit him, pointing out his criminal record and his plea deal, but the prosecution countered with the mountain of evidence that corroborated his story. By the end of the first day, it was clear the case was strong. But Morgan knew the fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was tense, the kind of silence that made every shuffle of paper and every quiet breath sound deafening. Morgan sat near the back, her arms crossed tightly as she watched the final day of the trial unfold. Sarah was beside her, a legal pad balanced on her lap, though her pen hadn't moved in minutes. All eyes were on the defense as Hendrix's high-powered attorney made his closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, his voice smooth and confident, "my client is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. The prosecution wants you to believe he masterminded a network of criminal activity based on nothing more than the word of a desperate man trying to save himself." The attorney gestured toward Tank, who sat hunched at the witness table, avoiding eye contact. "This is the kind of man you're trusting to build a case against Paul Hendrix. A man who's been arrested for numerous crimes, who only cooperated with the police to save his own skin. Is that the kind of testimony you'd stake your verdict on?" Morgan's jaw tightened as the attorney continued, pointing out every crack in the prosecution's case, no matter how minor. He was good. Too good. She stole a glance at Sarah, who was scribbling furiously now, her frustration evident. Finally, the defense rested, and the prosecutor, Simmons, rose to give her rebuttal. Her voice was clear, her tone precise, as she walked to the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense would have you believe that Paul Hendrix is nothing more than an innocent businessman caught up in a web of misunderstandings. But the evidence we've presented tells a different story." She turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. "We've shown you financial records tying Hendrix's companies to the funding of hate groups. We've shown you communication logs that connect his associates to the planning and execution of violent acts. And we've heard testimony from someone who operated within this network, someone who had everything to lose by coming forward." Simmons paused, letting her words settle. "Hate doesn't always wear a mask, and it doesn't always carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind a suit and a polished smile. But make no mistake, Paul Hendrix orchestrated this network of fear and intimidation, and today you have the power to hold him accountable." With that, Simmons sat down, her gaze steady as the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The waiting was unbearable. Hours passed, and Morgan paced the courthouse lobby, her mind replaying every piece of evidence, every moment of the trial. Sarah leaned against the wall, her arms crossed as she watched Morgan with concern. "You've done everything you could," Sarah said quietly. "It's out of your hands now." Morgan didn't respond. She knew Sarah was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Finally, a court officer stepped into the lobby. "The jury has reached a verdict." Morgan and Sarah exchanged a glance before following the crowd back into the courtroom. The room was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Hendrix sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. The judge addressed him. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The courtroom held its collective breath as the foreman read the decision. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit hate crimes, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrix, guilty. On the charge of funding and organizing criminal networks, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrix, guilty." The words echoed in the room, and for a moment there was silence. Then a murmur spread through the crowd, a mixture of relief and tension breaking at last. Hendrix's calm facade cracked, his expression twisting with barely concealed rage as the judge began to address sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Morgan stood on the steps, the crisp air filling her lungs as she watched reporters swarm the building. Sarah joined her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You did it," Sarah said. "He's finally going to face justice." Morgan didn't smile, though the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. This was just one battle. "There are others like him out there, and you'll deal with them too," Sarah said firmly. "But for now, this is a win." Reyes appeared, his face tired but satisfied. "They're recommending the maximum sentence. Hendrix won't see the outside of a cell for a long time." Morgan nodded. "Good. That's where he belongs." As the crowd swirled around them, Morgan allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, but she knew her work wasn't over. The fight against hate was never truly done, But today, they'd taken a step forward. The air felt lighter now, though the gravity of everything that had transpired still hung heavy in her chest. Paul Hendricks was going to prison, his empire of fear and hate dismantled brick by brick. But Morgan knew the fight wasn't over. Sarah joined her, handing her a coffee. "You should be proud of this. You took them down." Morgan took a sip, letting the warmth calm the ache in her ribs from the earlier confrontation. "It's a start, but this was bigger than Hendricks. There are others like him, people who think they can hide behind their money and power while pulling the strings." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "At least Tank and his crew are off the streets, and they helped bring this whole thing crashing down." Morgan's jaw tightened as she thought about the gang. Tank, Patchy Beard, and the younger men were all facing sentences of their own, though their cooperation with the authorities had lightened the consequences. Tank, in particular, had played a pivotal role in exposing Hendricks's network, though Morgan knew it was self-preservation, not remorse, that had driven him. "They'll pay for what they did," Morgan said, her voice steady. "Even if it's not as much as they deserve, they chose to help themselves. And it just happened to help the case." "Do you think they'll ever change?" Sarah asked, her tone hesitant. Morgan shook her head. "That's not my concern. My concern is making sure people like them can't hurt anyone else. And for now, they can't." Behind them, Reyes approached, holding a folder under his arm. His tired expression softened as he stopped beside them. "The sentencing for Tank's crew is set for next month. Tank will get at least 10 years, and the others are looking at 5 to 7, depending on how much weight the court gives their cooperation." Morgan nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's enough to keep them from terrorizing anyone for a while." Reyes shifted uncomfortably. "It's not perfect, but their testimony was the key to taking down Hendricks. Without it, he'd still be walking free." Morgan didn't respond immediately. She knew Reyes was right, but it didn't make the reality of their reduced sentences any easier to swallow. Still, Hendricks's conviction was the bigger victory. It wasn't just about one man. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could use fear and violence to control others. Later that evening, Morgan sat on the bench in the same park where it had all started. The bruises on her ribs were fading, but the memory of that day was still fresh. She thought about the gang cornering her, the words they'd spat, the hatred that had fueled their actions. They had underestimated her, as so many others had before them, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Morgan stood. Her work wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. Justice had been served, and for now, that was enough.